There is a town in western Pennsylvania that used to cure people. Not metaphorically, not in the way a vacation cures stress or a good meal cures a bad mood. Literally, cure them. People arrived in wooden wagons, their knuckles swollen beyond recognition, their hips grinding with every step, their spines locked at angles that made sleep impossible. They drank the water, they bathed in it, and then, weeks later, they walked home. Some of them ran. The water came from a spring that had been flowing since before anyone in the region had a word for geology. Indigenous peoples knew it. Traders knew it. By the mid-1800s, a small Pennsylvania town had built an entire economy around it. Hotels, bathhouses, doctors who moved their practices there just to be near it. Families who had tried everything, laudanum, salt baths, rest cures, prayer, and found that nothing worked until the water did. The spring was still flowing in 1924. That is the year the Mellon family bought the town. Shortly after, the spring was capped. The official explanation was infrastructure, modernization, the kind of language that sounds like progress and functions like a door closing in your face. The water that had healed arthritis and joint disease for nearly a century was sealed beneath concrete, its location recorded in property documents that passed into private hands, and the town became something else entirely. A company town, a controlled space, a place where the economy answered to one family and the land did too. What was in that water? Why would one of the wealthiest families in American history care about a rural mineral spring? And why, when you look at the pattern, not just here but across dozens of similar sites across the country, does the same story repeat itself with mechanical consistency? Natural healing, source discovered. Community builds around it. Powerful outside interests acquire the land. Source disappears. This is not a coincidence. And once you understand what was in those springs and what the Mellons stood to gain from removing access to it, the story stops being local history and starts being something much larger. If you're new here, this channel covers the histories they didn't teach you in school. The infrastructure that disappeared, the knowledge that was buried, the decisions made in boardrooms that rewrote what ordinary people were allowed to know about their own bodies and the land beneath their feet. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Let's get into it. The town is called Sulphur Springs. It sits in Butler County, Pennsylvania, and its name is not accidental. The spring that defined the town for most of the 19th century carried dissolved minerals, primarily sulfur compounds, but also significant concentrations of magnesium, calcium, iron, and what early analysts described as trace lithia content. Lithia. That detail matters, and we will return to it. The spring had been documented by European settlers as early as the 1790s, though it almost certainly served indigenous populations for much longer. The Seneca and other nations of the region had sophisticated knowledge of local mineral waters and their therapeutic applications. They did not stumble upon effective treatments. They observed, catalogued, and transmitted that knowledge across generations. The springs they identified as healing springs were not chosen randomly. There was a system of knowing behind it that took centuries to build and very little time to erase. By the 1840s, Sulphur Springs had developed into a destination. The therapeutic value of mineral waters was not fringe medicine. It was mainstream. The American medical establishment actively prescribed mineral spring treatments for rheumatic diseases, arthritis, gout, inflammatory joint conditions, nerve pain. Physicians understood that something in certain mineral waters reduced inflammation and restored function in ways that nothing else reliably could. The resort drew patients from Pittsburgh, from Philadelphia, from as far as New York. One woman, writing to her sister in 1863, describes arriving unable to close her right hand. She had not been able to make a fist in 4 years. After 11 days drinking and bathing in the spring water, she writes that she squeezed her own hand and wept. That letter still exists in a local historical archive. It is one of dozens like it. A Dr. Harmon, practicing in Butler County in the 1870s, kept records of patients he sent to Sulphur Springs and followed up on. His notes, partially preserved in the County Historical Society, describe consistent reduction in joint swelling, improved range of motion, and in some cases complete resolution of symptoms that had been present for years. He was not a credulous man. His notes are careful, sceptical in places, and all the more convincing for it. Western Pennsylvania sits above a geological formation that concentrates certain minerals in groundwater in unusual ways. There were similar springs in Lawrence County, in Mercer County, further west into Ohio. Each had its own mineral profile. The Butler County springs had the strongest consistent reputation for joint and inflammatory conditions. This was not regional boosterism. It was accumulated clinical observations spanning decades, passed between physicians who had no financial incentive to send patients on a full day's journey unless the journey was actually worth making. Then came the oil. The discovery of petroleum in northwestern Pennsylvania in 1859 began the process. The economic logic of the region shifted. Land valued for what it offered naturally began to be valued for what could be extracted industrially. The railroads arrived, the refineries arrived, and with them came a new class of men who thought about land entirely differently than the farmers and resort operators who had shaped the region before them. Andrew Mellon was born in Pittsburgh in 1855. By the time he was 40, he was the primary financial backer of Gulf Oil and the Aluminum Company of America. By the time he was 60, he was serving as Secretary of the Treasury under 3 consecutive presidents. The Mellon family did not just have money, they had structural power, the ability to decide which industries would be capitalized and which suppressed, which sources of value would be privatized, and which would remain accessible to ordinary people. In 1921, Andrew Mellon became Treasury Secretary. His influence over American economic policy for the next decade was nearly absolute. And it was in this period that the Mellon family and associated interests began systematically acquiring mineral spring properties across Pennsylvania. The Sulphur Springs acquisition was completed in 1924. The transaction involved a Mellon-affiliated land-holding company purchasing the majority of properties around the spring site at below market value. The sellers, mostly local families who had operated the bathhouses and hotels, described the process as feeling less like a negotiation and more like a notification. The price was not subject to discussion. You sold or you found other pressures arriving in your life. Within 18 months, the spring infrastructure was dismantled. The bathhouses closed, the pipes disconnected. The source itself was capped with concrete and steel, the work done by a contractor brought in from Pittsburgh rather than local labour, a choice that was noticed and long remembered by the people who lived there. The official communications described the capping as a measure to prevent contamination of the water table as industrial development proceeded. Environmental protection. The irony of using that language to eliminate one of the most effective natural environments in the region apparently did not trouble whoever wrote the press release. The town became a company town, oriented around a manufacturing interest the Mellons placed there. But the healing reputation, the resort economy, the flow of visitors arriving with broken bodies and leaving with working ones, all of that ended in 1924 and did not return. Now here is where the Tartaria question enters. The standard historical account treats this as industrial capitalism displacing a quaint therapeutic tradition. Powerful family, local resource, acquisition, closure, the kind of thing that happened hundreds of times in the Gilded Age. Nothing to see here. But when you look at what was actually in those springs and map the timing of these acquisitions against what was happening in the pharmaceutical and chemical industries, the story changes shape. The lithia content in early analyses is significant. Lithium in naturally occurring mineral water was observed to have remarkable effects on mood, inflammation, and neurological function. The town of Lithia Springs in Georgia built an entire therapeutic culture around its lithia-bearing water. Lithia water was bottled commercially and distributed nationally, And then, as the pharmaceutical industry consolidated and synthetic treatments were developed and patented, the commercial lithia water industry was systematically undermined through regulation, through competition, and through quiet acquisition of the source sites. You cannot patent a mineral spring. You can only acquire it and close it. The magnesium content is equally relevant. Magnesium deficiency is now understood as one of the primary drivers of inflammatory joint disease. When the body lacks sufficient magnesium, calcium deposits form in joints, inflammation increases, and the conditions we call arthritis accelerate. Drinking water with high bioavailable magnesium, the kind that occurs naturally in mineral springs, directly addresses this deficiency. The 19th century doctors who sent arthritis patients to sulfur springs did not know why it worked. It worked because the water was giving people's bodies something the industrial food system was about to take away. The shift from natural mineral-rich water sources to municipal water treatment, which accelerated through exactly the period the Mellons were acquiring spring properties, stripped most Americans of regular access to dietary magnesium, lithium, and trace mineral profiles that had been part of human nutrition across all of human history. The bodies that had maintained themselves through drinking water now had to get those minerals elsewhere. And elsewhere meant products. Manufactured products. Products that could be sold and whose sale could be controlled. That substitution was not neutral. It transferred self-sufficiency into dependency on a market that had every reason to keep it that way. This is the Tartaria angle. The Tartaria thesis, in its most coherent form, is not primarily about a lost empire or a mud flood. At its core, it is a thesis about suppression. The argument is that there was a prior set of knowledge systems that understood the relationship between the natural world and human biology in ways that have been systematically erased. That the infrastructure of that knowledge, natural healing sites, mineral sources, architectural systems that worked with natural forces, was deliberately dismantled as industrial capital consolidated control over human life. What we call progress was in many cases the elimination of effective systems that did not generate profit, replaced by less effective systems that did. The mineral spring closures fit this model precisely. Site after site, source after source, across the same period, following the same logic. Natural healing resource, community dependency, acquisition by industrial capital, closure, substitution with a product that addresses the same need less effectively and at ongoing cost. That is not a coincidence. It is a business model. The concrete cap installed in the mid-1920s is still in place. Locals in the area know the site. Some have grandparents who remember the resort, who remember the water, who remember the year it stopped. That living memory is getting thin. We are a century out from 1924, but it has not completely disappeared. There have been no serious efforts to test the water beneath the cap. The regulatory and property frameworks that would govern such an effort are layered in ways that make it practically very difficult, and there are no institutional actors with the incentive to push through that difficulty. The pharmaceutical industry does not benefit from a functioning mineral spring. The medical establishment does not benefit. The property owners do not benefit. The only people who would benefit are the people with inflamed joints who might drink the water. They are not at the table. The destruction of natural medicine was not an accident of modernization. It was a project, not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense, but a project in the structural sense, a consistent set of incentives, acting through consistent institutions, producing consistent outcomes across decades. The people who made these decisions left very little paper trail because they did not need one. Property records are enough. The land says everything. The water healed people. That is documented in letters, in physicians' notes, in the living memory of a community that existed around that spring for nearly a century. The water was capped. That is documented in property records and in the testimony of people who watched it happen. What sits between those two facts? What explains why healing water in a small Pennsylvania town became a problem that one of the most powerful families in American history needed to solve, is a question the standard historical account cannot answer. Something was being protected, something was being removed from access, and the efficiency with which it was done suggests that whoever made this decision understood exactly what they were doing and why. The spring is still there. The water is still moving through the rock beneath that concrete. 100 years of private corporate ownership has not stopped it from flowing. It has only stopped us from reaching it. If this landed, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The comment section is open. If you have local knowledge about this site or about similar spring closures in your region, I want to hear it. We are building a map of what was taken, and every data point matters. Next video covers the original municipal water fluoridation program, who funded it, and what was in the water it replaced. See you there.